In November 1941, a surgeon asked a young woman to sing. She sang "God Bless America." She recited the Lord's Prayer. She counted backward from 100. While she was singing, while the words were still forming in her mouth, a doctor named James Watts was cutting into her brain with an instrument that looked like a butter knife. He swung it up and down. He cut through tissue. He cut through the part of her that made her herself. When she stopped making sense, when the words became incoherent and the counting stopped and the song dissolved into something that was no longer language, they stopped cutting. They had gone too far. Rosemary Kennedy was 23 years old. She never spoke clearly again. She never walked without a limp again. She spent the next 63 years in an institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin, in a private cottage that her father had built for her on the grounds of St. Coletta's School, while her brothers became senators and presidents, and the Kennedy name became the most powerful political dynasty in American history. Her father never visited her there. Not once. Her mother did not visit for 20 years. Her siblings did not know where she was for most of that time. The family told the public she was reclusive. They said she preferred a quiet life. They said she was mentally retarded, which was not the truth of what she was before the surgery, and certainly not the truth of what the surgery had made her. The truth, the specific, documented, devastating truth, did not become publicly known until 1987, 46 years after the surgery, when a historian named Doris Kearns Goodwin finally named it in a book. 46 years. I am Mary, and today finally we are going to tell the story of Rosemary Kennedy, not as a footnote in her brothers' biographies, not as the sister who disappeared, not as the tragedy that inspired the Special Olympics, though she was all of these things, as herself, as the woman who kept a diary full of dances and concerts and a visit to the Roosevelt White House, as the woman who practiced a royal curtsy for hours before meeting the King of England, as the woman who wrote to her father just 1 year before the surgery, "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you and I love you so much," as the woman who was singing when they cut into her brain, "Stay with me," because by the time this video ends, you will not be able to say the Kennedy name without hearing her name first. Joe Kennedy authorized the surgery without telling his wife Rose. Rose did not find out what had truly happened to her daughter for years. The specific moment she found out, and what she said to a neighbor when she finally understood what her husband had done, is coming. And it will tell you everything about what this family required of the women inside it. Rosemary Kennedy was born on the 13th of September, 1918, at her parents' home in Brookline, Massachusetts. She was the third child and first daughter of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. She was named after her mother. She was called Rosemary. She was called Rosie. And here is the first thing you need to understand about Rosemary Kennedy, the thing that makes everything that happened to her not simply tragic, but specifically, deliberately unjust. She was not severely disabled. The nurse who delivered her on the 13th of September 1918, in a household where the family doctor was delayed because of the Spanish influenza epidemic sweeping America that year, made a decision. She told Rose Kennedy to keep her legs closed, to hold the baby in the birth canal until the doctor arrived. Rose Kennedy, alone in her room, in labor, with no medical authority in the house, did what she was told. Rosemary's head stayed in the birth canal for 2 hours. 2 hours of oxygen deprivation. 2 hours that altered the development of a brain that was otherwise forming perfectly. 2 hours that produced what the family later described as intellectual disability, but which manifested, in Rosemary's actual life, as something considerably more nuanced than that description suggests. She was slower than her siblings. This is true. She struggled with reading and writing. Her academic skills, with the help of tutors and specialized schools, reached approximately a 4th grade level. She had developmental delays that her family spent enormous energy trying to manage and equally enormous energy trying to hide. But here is what Rosemary Kennedy actually was documented, in her own words, in the diaries she kept as a teenager and young woman. She went to the opera. She attended tea dances. She went to dress fittings. She visited the Roosevelt White House. She traveled to Rome with her family for the coronation of Pope Pius XII. She was presented as a debutante to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace in 1938, and she practiced the complicated royal curtsy for hours with the specific, determined focus of a woman who understood what was being asked of her and was prepared to meet it. At the event in front of the King and Queen of England, she tripped, nearly fell, recovered. The King and Queen smiled as though nothing had happened. The crowd made no sign. Rose Kennedy never discussed the incident and treated the debut as a triumph. Because that is what you did in the Kennedy family. You performed, you recovered, you treated every stumble as a triumph, because the alternative, acknowledging that something had gone wrong, was institutionally prohibited. Her diary entries from 1936 to 1938, published decades after her death, reveal a young woman whose interior life was warm and social and fully present. She wrote about the people she met. She wrote about the dances. She wrote about her family with affection. She was not absent from her own experience. She was entirely there, documenting it with the care of someone who understood that her life was worth recording. She wrote to her father, "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you, and I love you so much." This was 1 year before he authorized surgery on her brain without telling her mother. Now the Kennedys. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was a man of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary compartmentalization. He had built a fortune through banking, through real estate, through Hollywood, where he made the equivalent of over $90 million in today's money. He had served as United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. He had dreams documented, specific, consuming dreams of being the first Catholic president of the United States. And when that dream was torpedoed by his vocal opposition to American involvement in World War II and his catastrophically public anti-Semitism, he transferred the dream to his sons, not his daughters. The Kennedy daughters existed in the institutional logic of their father's ambition as assets to be managed, as appearances to be maintained, as potential liabilities if they behaved in ways that drew the wrong kind of attention. Rosemary was a liability, not because she was severely disabled, not because she was dangerous, but because she was different, because she was difficult to hide and difficult to explain. Because her father had decided, with the specific, cold calculation of a man who had decided that his family's image was more important than any individual person inside it, that she embarrassed him. And in 1941, when doctors told Joseph Kennedy Sr. that a lobotomy might calm his daughter's mood swings and stop her occasional emotional outbursts, he made a decision. He did not tell Rose. He did not tell any of his children. He did not ask Rosemary. He said yes. The surgeon who performed the lobotomy later told a biographer that in his medical opinion, Rosemary Kennedy did not have intellectual disability at all. She had a form of depression. That detail, what it means and what it changes about this entire story, is coming. By 1940, when the Kennedy family returned from London to the United States, Rosemary was 22 years old. Her sister Eunice later wrote that Rosemary was not making progress, but seemed instead to be going backward, that at 22 she was becoming increasingly irritable and difficult. Now here is what the historical record shows about what was actually happening to Rosemary Kennedy in 1940 and 1941, because the institutional Kennedy narrative has always described her deterioration in ways that served the family's interests rather than Rosemary's. She had been sent to a convent school in Washington, D.C., after being expelled from a summer camp in Massachusetts and a boarding school in Philadelphia. At the convent school, she began sneaking out at night. The nuns at the convent were concerned. They believed she might be meeting men. They worried about pregnancy. They worried about sexually transmitted disease. They reported their concerns to her parents. And here is what Joseph Kennedy Sr. heard when those concerns were reported to him. He heard scandal. He heard the specific, career-ending, dynasty-destroying nightmare of a Kennedy daughter doing something publicly that could not be managed. Rosemary had always been the liability he could not fully control. Now, in his reading of the situation, she was becoming dangerous. He was not thinking about Rosemary. He was thinking about John, who was being positioned for political office. He was thinking about the Kennedy name, which was already damaged by his own public statements about the war. He was thinking about what a scandal involving his eldest daughter would do to the carefully constructed edifice of Kennedy respectability that he had spent his entire adult life building. So when a doctor told him that a new procedure, prefrontal lobotomy, might calm his daughter's mood swings and make her more manageable, Joseph Kennedy said yes. Now here is the medical reality of 1941 that makes this decision even more specific in its cruelty. The lobotomy was not, in 1941, a proven or reliable treatment for anything. It was new. It was experimental. Walter Freeman, the doctor who pioneered the procedure in America, had been performing lobotomies since 1936. The medical establishment was divided about its efficacy and deeply uncertain about its long-term effects. What was known, what any responsible physician would have communicated to a parent considering this procedure for their child, was that it was irreversible, that it could cause permanent damage, that the outcomes were unpredictable. Joseph Kennedy authorized it anyway, without telling Rose, without telling any of his children, without asking Rosemary. And here is the detail from Dr. James Watts, the surgeon who performed the procedure alongside Walter Freeman, that changes everything about how we understand what happened in that operating room in November 1941. Watts told biographer Ronald Kessler that in his medical opinion, Rosemary Kennedy did not have intellectual disability at all. She had depression. Not the intellectual disability the family had been describing for years. Not the condition that Joe Kennedy had used to explain his daughter's differences to the public. Depression. A treatable condition. A condition that in 1941 was not well understood, but which was even then not typically addressed by cutting into someone's brain. Bertram Brown, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, told Kessler something even more specific. He said that Joe Kennedy had deliberately described Rosemary as intellectually disabled rather than mentally ill in order to protect John's reputation for a presidential run. Read that again. Joe Kennedy chose the label that better served his political ambitions over the label that better described his daughter's actual condition. And then he authorized surgery on her brain, without telling anyone. Rosemary wrote to her father 1 year before the surgery, "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you and I love you so much." He never responded to her with the same openness. And after the surgery, he never visited her at the institution. Not once. What that absence cost her, and what it tells you about the man who made the decision, is coming. The surgery took place in November 1941. Rosemary was given a mild sedative, not general anesthesia. She was awake. Dr. Watts and Dr. Freeman made a surgical incision through the top of her skull near the front of her brain on both sides. The incision was approximately 1 inch. Dr. Watts later described the instrument he used as looking like a butter knife. He swung it up and down. He cut brain tissue. While he cut, Dr. Freeman asked Rosemary questions. He asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer, to sing "God Bless America," to count backward. They made their estimate of how far to cut based on how she responded. When Rosemary began to become incoherent, when the words stopped making sense and the counting fell apart, they stopped. Dr. Watts later said, "We made an estimate on how far to cut based on how she responded. When Rosemary began to become incoherent, they stopped. They had gone too far. It quickly became apparent that the procedure had caused catastrophic damage. Rosemary's mental capacity was reduced to approximately that of a 2-year-old child. She could not walk. She could not speak intelligibly. She was incontinent. The woman who had kept diaries full of tea dances and opera visits and letters to her father, the woman who had practiced a royal curtsy for hours and nearly fallen in front of the King of England and recovered with composure, was gone. What was left required institutional care for the rest of her life. Joe Kennedy did not tell Rose what he had done. Rose Kennedy did not find out the truth about her daughter's lobotomy for years. The official accounts vary on exactly when she was told and what she was told. But what is documented is that she did not know, at the time the surgery was performed, what her husband had authorized. The man who shared her bed, who had fathered 9 children with her, who had built the dynasty she had given her life to supporting, had made a catastrophic, irreversible decision about their daughter without her knowledge or consent. Rosemary was initially sent to Craig House, a private psychiatric hospital about 90 minutes north of New York City. In 1949, 8 years after the surgery, she was transferred to St. Coletta's School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin. Archbishop Cushing of Boston had recommended the institution to her father. Joe Kennedy traveled to Jefferson and built a private cottage for her on the grounds, a cottage the nuns called the Kennedy Cottage. 2 Catholic nuns provided her primary care. She had a car for rides. She had a dog for walks. Joe Kennedy never visited, not once. In the years between 1941 and his stroke in 1961, 20 years, Joseph Kennedy Sr. never visited the daughter whose brain he had authorized surgeons to cut while she was awake and singing. Rose Kennedy did not visit for 20 years either. Rosemary's siblings did not know where she was. In 1958, when John Kennedy was campaigning for re-election to the Senate, the family explained Rosemary's absence by saying she was reclusive. She preferred a quiet life. She was simply not present at family events. The family that had brought her to Buckingham Palace. The family that had taken her to Rome for the papal coronation. The family that had posed for photographs with her at Hyannis Port throughout her childhood. That family now described her as someone who preferred to be away. She was in Wisconsin, in a cottage on the grounds of an institution, with 2 nuns and a dog, and a car she could be taken on rides in. She was 31 years old when they moved her to St. Coletta's. And here is the detail that makes the silence most devastating. While Rosemary was in Wisconsin, while her family was constructing the explanation that she was simply reclusive, her diaries were sitting somewhere. The diaries she had kept as a teenager, full of her own voice, her own observations, her own affection for the world she had been part of. "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you, and I love you so much." He never visited her. In 1961, after Joe Kennedy had a massive stroke that left him unable to speak, Rosemary's siblings finally found out where she was. What happened when they arrived in Wisconsin? What Eunice Kennedy saw when she walked into that cottage is coming. And it is the moment this story changes from a tragedy into something closer to accountability. In November 1961, 20 years after the surgery, Joe Kennedy Sr. suffered a massive stroke. He was paralyzed on his right side. He lost his ability to speak clearly. The man who had controlled every narrative, who had authorized the surgery without telling anyone, and maintained the silence for 2 decades through the specific, consuming force of his own will, could no longer control anything. And the secret came out. Rosemary's siblings were told where she was. They had not known. For 20 years, while John was campaigning and Bobby was investigating union corruption, and Ted was building his Senate career, none of them had known that their sister was in a cottage on the grounds of an institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin. The family had been told she was away, that she was in special care, that she was fine. They had not known the truth. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who had been perhaps the closest of all the Kennedy siblings to Rosemary during their childhood, went to Wisconsin. She walked into the Kennedy cottage at St. Coletta's, and she saw her sister, the woman who had danced at debutante balls, who had visited the Roosevelt White House, who had been presented to the King of England, who had written in her diary about concerts and opera and tea dances with the warm, present voice of someone fully alive to her own experience. Eunice saw what 20 years had done, what the surgery had left, what the silence had covered. And here is what Eunice Kennedy Shriver did with what she saw. She did not perform composure. She did not manage the narrative. She did not protect the family image. She went home and she acted. In 1962, 1 year after her father's stroke revealed Rosemary's location, Eunice started a summer day camp in her own backyard in Maryland for children and adults with intellectual disabilities. People who had been hidden from public life the way her sister had been hidden. People whose families had been ashamed of them the way Joe Kennedy had been ashamed of Rosemary. She brought them to her home. She swam with them in her pool. She ate with them. She was present with them in the specific, costly way that presence requires, not as a patron from a distance, but as a person in the same physical space. That backyard camp, begun in 1962, became the Special Olympics, founded formally in 1968, now involving 1.4 million athletes from 150 countries. The largest sports organization for people with intellectual disabilities in the world. Eunice Kennedy Shriver built that because she walked into a cottage in Wisconsin and saw her sister. And here is the specific, important truth about the Special Olympics that Eunice herself told the New York Times in 1995. She said that Rosemary was not the only inspiration, that the Games should not focus on any single individual, that she would bring many people with disabilities to her home to swim, not only her sister. She said this because she understood something that the family mythology had always resisted understanding, that Rosemary was not unique in her erasure, that what had been done to her, the hiding, the institutionalization, the silence, had been done to thousands of people whose families were ashamed of them, whose existence was managed rather than celebrated, whose potential was buried by the specific, institutional logic of families that valued appearance over truth. Rosemary was not unique. She was an example. And Eunice, who had grown up inside the same institution that had hidden her sister, spent the rest of her life refusing to participate in the hiding. She also inspired her brother, President Kennedy, to initiate sweeping legislation to improve the quality of life for Americans with disabilities. She inspired her sister, Jean Kennedy Smith, to start Very Special Arts. She inspired her nephew, Anthony Shriver, to start Best Buddies. All of this, every organization, every piece of legislation, every athlete who has ever stood on a Special Olympics field traces back to a cottage in Wisconsin, to a woman who kept a diary full of tea dances, to a surgery performed in November 1941 on a woman who was singing while they cut. After her father died in 1969, Rosemary was gradually brought back into family life. She began visiting Hyannis Port again, the place where she had been a child. What those visits looked like, and what Rose Kennedy said to a neighbor when she finally understood the full weight of what had happened to her daughter, is coming. Joe Kennedy Sr. died in November 1969. He was 81 years old. He died having never visited his daughter at St. Coletta's, having never sat in the Kennedy cottage, having never looked at what the butter knife had made of the woman who had written to him, "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you and I love you so much." After his death, gradually, carefully, Rosemary was brought back into family life. She began to visit relatives in Florida and Washington. She was taken to her childhood home on Cape Cod. The beaches and the compound and the physical landscape of the family she had been removed from at 23, she returned to them, not fully. Not in the way she had been part of them before, but present, allowed, included. By this time she had learned to walk again. She walked with a limp, a permanent consequence of the neurological damage the surgery had caused. Her arm was palsied. She never regained the ability to speak clearly. And Rose Kennedy, who had not visited her daughter for 20 years, who had maintained the composure and the silence and the Kennedy institutional requirements for 2 decades, while her daughter was in Wisconsin, Rose Kennedy finally faced the full weight of what had been done. She confided to a neighbor, in the specific, private way of someone who has carried something too long and can no longer maintain the performance of not carrying it. She said that of all the Kennedy tragedies, of all the losses and deaths and assassinations and scandals that had defined her family's public history, Rosemary's fate was the worst. The worst. Not John, not Bobby, not Joseph Jr., not any of the public commemorated, nationally mourned losses of the Kennedy family. Rosemary, the daughter the family had hidden, the woman in the cottage in Wisconsin, the woman who had sung God Bless America while a doctor cut into her brain with an instrument that looked like a butter knife. The worst tragedy. Rose Kennedy had 9 children. She buried 4 of them. Joseph Jr. at 29, Kathleen at 28, John at 46, Bobby at 42. She watched Ted's career destroyed by the body of a young woman in a car submerged in water. She endured her husband's decades of infidelity. She survived 5 strokes and lived to be 104 years old. And she told a neighbor that Rosemary was the worst tragedy, because Rosemary was the loss that came from inside the family, not from war or plane crashes or assassins' bullets, from her husband, from a decision made without her knowledge, from an institution, her own family, that had decided Rosemary's life was worth less than the reputation it might compromise. The lobotomy's existence was not publicly known until 1987, when historian Doris Kearns Goodwin revealed it in her book The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys. 46 years after it happened, Rosemary Kennedy had been in that Wisconsin cottage for 46 years before America knew why. Rosemary Kennedy died on the 7th of January 2005. She was 86 years old. Her siblings were there, the sisters and brother, who had not known where she was for 20 years. What was said at her funeral, and what Eunice said about her legacy, is the most important thing ever said about Rosemary Kennedy. That is coming right now. Here is what the Kennedy family said about Rosemary publicly for most of the 20th century: that she was mentally retarded, that she preferred a quiet life, that she was reclusive, that she was at peace in her institution. Here is what they did not say: that she had kept a diary full of opera visits and tea dances, that she had practiced a royal curtsy for hours, that she had gone to the Roosevelt White House, that she had been presented at the court of St. James, that she had written to her father with love, that she had been awake when they cut into her brain, that her father had never visited her afterward, that her mother had not come for 20 years, that her siblings had not known where she was for most of those years. Here is what Eunice Kennedy Shriver said at her sister's funeral in 2005. She said Rosemary had left a legacy that was long and deep. She had inspired the Special Olympics. She had inspired legislation that changed the lives of Americans with disabilities. She had inspired very special arts and best buddies, and every organization founded by the Kennedy family in her name. She had done all of this from a cottage in Wisconsin, from behind the silence her father had built around her, from inside the institution that had hidden her for 63 years. Her legacy was long and deep. And I want to add one thing to what Eunice said. Rosemary Kennedy's legacy is not only the organizations that bear her influence. It is the specific, documented proof that an institution, even one as powerful as the Kennedy family, cannot permanently erase a person. She was hidden for 46 years before the truth came out. Her diaries survived. Her voice survived. "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you and I love you so much." The woman who wrote that line is not the woman the family described. She is not the liability. She is not the embarrassment. She is not the tragedy that had to be hidden to protect a presidential candidate. She is a woman who loved her father, who practiced her curtsy, who went to the opera, who sang "God Bless America," who kept singing right up until they told her to stop. Rosemary Kennedy died on the 7th of January, 2005. She was 86 years old. She died at Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital in Wisconsin, close to St. Coletta's, where she had lived for 56 years. Her sisters, Eunice, Jean, and Patricia, were there. Her brother Ted was there. She was buried beside her parents at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts, the same town where she was born, where the nurse told her mother to keep her legs closed for 2 hours, where everything that followed began. Here is what I take from the life of Rosemary Kennedy. She was the first daughter of the most powerful Catholic family in America. She was born with a disability that was entirely a product of a nurse's decision on a single September morning in 1918. She grew up in a family that loved her in the specific, complicated, conditional way that ambitious families love the people inside them and that loved their image more. She attended the coronation of the Pope. She danced at debutante balls. She was presented to the King of England. She wrote in a diary about a life that was genuinely full. Not the life of someone who needed to be hidden, but the life of someone who needed support and accommodation, and the specific grace of being allowed to be different without being erased. She received none of those things from her father. She received a butter knife through her brain. She received a cottage in Wisconsin. She received 20 years without her mother. She received the specific, consuming silence of an institution that had decided her existence was a liability. And then she received, through her sister, through the backyard camp that became the Special Olympics, through the legislation her brother signed as president, a legacy that extends to 1.4 million athletes in 150 countries. She did not choose that legacy. It was built from the wreckage of what was done to her, but it is hers. Here is what should also be said, what Eunice said, and what history confirms. Rosemary Kennedy was not alone. The thousands of people who were lobotomized in the 1940s and 1950s, who were institutionalized by families who were ashamed of them, who were hidden behind the language of mental retardation, when the truth was depression or anxiety or simply difference. Those people are Rosemary. 2. Their names were not Kennedy. Their fathers were not ambassadors. Their brothers did not become presidents. They were simply hidden, and nobody built organizations in their honor. The specific injustice of Rosemary Kennedy's story is not only what Joe Kennedy did, it is the system that made what he did possible. The system that told a family that disability was shameful, that difference was a liability, that the correct response to a daughter who was inconvenient was to make her disappear. Joe Kennedy acted within that system. He acted worst within it, but the system made it possible. And here is the question I want to leave with you. Rosemary Kennedy wrote to her father, "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you and I love you so much." He never visited her, not once. After the surgery, after the cottage, after 20 years of silence and 46 years of secrets and 63 years in Wisconsin, he never came. Does a father who never visited the daughter he had damaged beyond recovery, does that father deserve the dynasty he built? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. If this story moved you, please share it. Because Rosemary Kennedy kept a diary full of opera visits and tea dances and love letters to her father. She practiced a royal curtsy for hours. She visited the Roosevelt White House. She was 23 years old and singing when they cut into her brain. She was not reclusive. She was not at peace. She was hidden. And she deserved so much more than 63 years in a cottage in Wisconsin while her brothers became presidents. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy. She was the first daughter. She was always first. Next, we go deeper into the world of women who were erased by the same institutional logic that erased Rosemary. A woman whose story connects directly to everything you have heard today, whose own experience of being a Kennedy, of being required to maintain composure while the institution consumed everything around her, will make this video feel suddenly and uncomfortably familiar. Subscribe so you do not miss it. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.